We are live. Top of the morning to you. We are live. It's 10 a.m. Let's go. Let's get a little build the beat going on. All right. If y'all can hear me well, I'm on my mic today. I don't have my headphones on. So I want to make sure everything is heard well. If you guys can hear me good, hit the number 8. Hit that number 8 so I can continue if you can hear me well through this microphone. I'm usually on my headphones, but I think my microphone works fine. All right, I see some 8s. Appreciate y'all. Dr. Banoob is quick at the trigger today. Donnie Williams is quick. So the title says, Ancient Egyptians, Genetics, right? The Mediterranean Truth with the Experts. See, some people have claimed to be sharing experts' information, but not really, right? So I also have on the thumbnail where it said population genetics. Thank you, Mama E, 1999. I also have, what does the description say? I can't see from where I'm at. Hold on. What did I put in the description? I put modern day Egyptians are the ancient Egyptians. That's what this is based off of. This little conversation we're going to have today. Says the experts in science, not me, right? The experts in science says so. Today we listen to the master teacher, Razib Khan, discuss population genetics in reference to the ancient Egyptians and their genetic origins. Right? Y'all like my cup? Top of the morning. I'm usually not, up and operating this early. But you see I got the X on there, representing the Chief X for Xavier. Gotta have you some coffee. So, this is what we're talking about. And the guy's name I have in the description, Razib Khan, is the expert, right? And let me just show you so we can be clear, right? And as I'm listening to Razib, he was on Coleman's YouTube channel doing an interview. And as I listen to him, he speaks on everything I'm speaking of. And that is basically population genetics. People like to change the subject and try to muddy the waters and cry and whine about the words black, cry and whine about the words negroid, and it's okay. Basically, what I've been talking about is population genetics and who a group of people is and where they come from. That's what I'm talking about. And Razib Khan is the perfect person for that. I'm not up here, and I haven't been up here talking about skin color. That's petty and immature. I'm not talking about variations of skin color. That's never been my discussion. Because most people, all people, even the Egyptians, you can go to Cambodia, you can go to Iran, right? You can go to the Philippines, right? You can go to Mexico. We all vary in degrees of melanin. So why would I be talking about skin color? So you guys can play around and say, oh, these are dark people, and then act like you're talking about black people, but no, you're not talking about black people. You know what I mean? People are tall, dark, and handsome. They may be talking about an Italian man who's 6'2" and tall, dark, and handsome. So all these word games people are doing and talking about skin color is something I've never been talking about. I've been talking about population genetics, basically. I started to use the word negroid only because people are running from the word black and acting like they don't know what black is anymore. When you say black people, oh, who's that? That's a social construct and all, and trying to muddy the waters and confuse you so they can still kind of be fit themselves into ancient Egypt and confuse you and make y'all stop the cap. Okay? So, the guy I'm using today, the expert, oh, you know what? Let me speak to the chat. What's happening, chat? Jason, what's happening? How you doing? Hey, Faith. Faith says exactly. You know what I mean? People ain't stupid, y'all. Y'all can try to muddy the water and play them games. Even the people who agree with you or want to agree with you are looking at you, yeah. I'm going to help him bullshit because I don't want Chief X to win this argument. So I'm going to help bullshit the people and help muddy the waters. But we know what Chief X is talking about. So what's up, Jason, Faith? Unbiased Talks. What's happening with you, man? Donnie Williams, Dr. Banu, Mama E, 1999, Snow Forest, right? Sugar Hayes, Sweet Sugar, Sugar Hayes, Astro 87, right? Kemet Roots is up in here. Some names I cannot pronounce. Blasian King, right? Yeah, so let's go and get started. Let me share my screen. Let me stop sharing for a minute. Now let me share. Bam. Bam. I want to share the entire screen. Well, all right. Here we go. Razib Khan, I said I'm using. He's an expert. I just want to show you his wiki page and just show you, you know what I mean? He has a wiki page. Razib Khan, right? Life and education. Khan was born in Dhaka, Bangladesh, right? He's in Bangladesh, but moved to the United States at the age of 5. His family is Bengali, Muslim, from a district of eastern Bangladesh, right? Okay. I just wanted to show you his education. So he grew up at the University of Oregon. He completed his bachelor's in science in biochemistry in 2000. He got another bachelor's. He completed a bachelor of science in biology in 2006, right? He did graduate work at the University of California, Davis, right? So a lot of people really like this guy. He's highly touted, right? In 2002, he co-founded a blog called Gene Expression, right? He's basically a geneticist, right? Which discussed technical and social issues of genetics, right? So he is into what? Let me just make this big so you guys can see. He's the perfect individual. He is into what it says here. Let me see. Oops. He's a writer in what? Population genetics. Okay? What is population genetics? Population genetics. Let me just blow this up so we can all see and read together. I like to show and prove and be clear, right? I got it too big. Okay. Population genetics is a subfield of genetics that deals with genetic differences within and among populations, okay? The population we're talking about is ancient Egypt, right? Among populations, and is part of the evolutionary biology. It is part of evolutionary biology. Studies in this branch of biology, as you know, he has a degree in biology. Hold on, yeah. What's up, Rashad? Hello? Oh, damn. You here? You parked already? Okay, knock on the door. I'm doing a live stream, but come on. Hold on, y'all. Don't My son is showed up. We're gonna do this. Let me just let him in. Hold on a second. One second, y'all. It's okay. It's okay. You look like who's on your shirt too.
Michael Jordan?
Yeah, y'all favorite look. Look at the camera. Let him see your face. There go my son. Hold on, y'all. One second, fam.
My mom made these?
Long time ago.
I don't remember that, man.
So, I'll be down there. You just set you up.
Do you think?
You just set you up for something.
I'm gonna call my friend. I gotta tell them a story that happened this weekend. Gotta get you an update on some Northwest. Yeah, these old.
But there you go. So, you have to manually turn this down right here. Because I can't find my volume. So it's right here.
From News One, brought to you by the law offices of Jacob M. Ronnie. Accident or injury? Call Jacob M. Ronnie or visit calljacob.com today.
All right. He said he does look like him, Shay. That's my son. He played football at Northwestern Missouri State University. We're going to visit my brother today. I forgot he was coming this early. All right. So population genetics, right? Let me figure out where I left off at. She's Donnie Williams. Don't play with that chair. All right, let's get cracking again. Okay, so I'm just reading the definition of population genetics. Population genetics is a subfield of genetics that deals with genetic differences within and among populations and is part of the evolutionary biology. Studies in this branch of biology, examine such phenomenon as adaptation, speciation, and population structure, right? Population genetics was a vital ingredient in the emergence of the modern evolutionary synthesis. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a definition, right? Razib Khan, who we're listening to, has spoken on, and has spoke on subjects that people have been speaking on without the experts, right? People has been speaking on this human pigmentation, the genetics and evolution of human shades, right? That's something I'm not talking about. Skin color and variations of skin color. People were talking about that to throw you off, to play word games, light-skinned and dark-skinned, to confuse you. They don't know if you're talking about a Caucasoid or Asian or Sub-Saharan African. I mean, so I'm just letting you know Khan speaks on these subjects. If you want to go watch this, that would be probably good for you color-focused people. The science of color, basically. Human pigmentation, the genetics and the evolution of human shades, okay? Khan speaks on that. This is his lane. This right here we'll be watching a brief clip on. It says right here, Khan speaks on this, is race a social construct, as you see, right? That's just a thumbnail, right? The title of that lecture on Coleman Hughes' YouTube channel, Genes, Race, and History with Razib Khan. That's Razib Khan and Coleman Hughes having a conversation. Coleman Hughes has an intellectual YouTube channel. Anyone that's on Coleman Hughes' YouTube channel, anyone he interviews is a bad boy in whatever subject he's talking about, or Coleman Hughes would never have him on. Let's be clear. Okay? So, let's move on from this. Let's just play this brief clip then real quick. I got it keyed up. Listen.
What did Cleopatra look like? Because people are upset that she is, Egyptians are upset that.
I'm just leading up because this would just spawn this part of this conversation. He asked, what did Cleopatra look like? So the geneticist is going to speak to it. And then he's going to give you a little brief shout about the genetics of the ancient Egyptians, right? Let's just hear it. So I'm just about 3 minutes real quick.
That she's being portrayed by a black woman, and not even a particularly dark-skinned.
Yeah, she's a mixed race British black woman.
Yeah. So what did she look like?
Yeah, well, we know what she looked like because there was a bust that was created when she was being held. I think that was when she was held hostage in Rome under Caesar. And there's like coins. She looked like a Balkan woman. I think there's like records of her having maybe auburnish hair. She had like a big nose, like not necessarily even a Roman nose, but just like a big nose. Just, pretty Balkan features. Most of her ancestry, we know what it is. She's Macedonian, Greco-Macedonian is maybe the way you want to say it. And then she has a little bit of Iranian ancestry through her Seleucid and Pontic
And to
lineage.
this point, would she look more like a person from that region today? Or
Yeah, she would look like a person from Greece. I think she would look like a person from Greece,
like
honestly.
a woman from Greece.
Yeah, I mean, 80% of the ancestry of the Levant dates to 1800 BC. I'm saying 1800 BC very specifically because there are some ancient DNA remains from the port of Sidon, and you take those people and you like substitute them into modern Middle Eastern people, and it's like 80%. Okay, 20% is new stuff. So that's why I say numbers like this and with specific
Pause. 80%. Let's hear that again.
dates. Sidon, and you take those people and you like substitute them into modern Middle Eastern people, and it's like 80%. Okay, 20% is new stuff. So that's why I say numbers like this and with specific dates. We have ancient DNA. I have a date. I give you a date, and I give you the percentage based on the calculation, right?
Yeah.
And so, the issue with Cleopatra is like it's not controversial. She's known. This is just American ideology infecting history. The reason I get angry about it is like there's a lot of history we don't know. And there's history we do know. This is history we really know. She's just making stuff up.
Yeah.
And like most people, you want to say like, oh, well, they'll know the truth. Like they don't know the truth. And a lot of the Afrocentric stuff, the Hotep stuff, is starting to like bleed.
Hold on. He's clowning Afrocentric stuff. He said the Hotep stuff. You guys are known for being bullshitters. He said most of the Afrocentric stuff, the Hotepers. Let's go.
They'll know the truth. Like they don't know the truth. And a lot of the Afrocentric stuff, the Hotep stuff, is starting to like bleed into the regular discourse. And it's like, I don't really care. Like if like, you can think whatever you want to think, like you shouldn't take it seriously, right? But then like intelligent people are taking it seriously now.
Right.
So it's like, what do we do about this? So the Egyptians.
So he said intelligent people are taking it serious now. What these Hotepers are doing and how they're misinforming. So it's time to really address this shit. That's what he's saying.
They know that she's Macedonian too. Like they have a whole history, and I have a post about ancient Egyptian DNA. Basically, like modern Egyptians, like they're mostly from ancient Egypt. They have a lot more sub-Saharan African ancestry than they did in the past, and that's because the Islamic period brought in a lot of that.
Right.
Egyptian DNA. Basically, like modern Egyptians, like they're mostly from ancient Egypt. They have a lot more sub-Saharan African ancestry than they did in the past, and that's because the Islamic period brought in a lot of that. ancient Egyptian DNA. Basically, like modern Egyptians, like they're mostly from ancient Egypt. They have a lot more sub-Saharan African ancestry than they did in the past, and that's because the Islamic period brought in a lot of that.
Right.
You know? Egyptian DNA. Basically, like modern Egyptians, like they're mostly from ancient Egypt. They have a lot more sub-Saharan African ancestry than they did in the past, and that's because the Islamic period brought in a lot of that.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And then there's also some northern ancestry, like the Mamelukes were mostly Kipchak Turks and Circassians. But
Yeah. So I mean, I remember.
Pause. What he said was the ancient Egyptians are the modern Egyptians are the ancient Egyptians. I got a video right now on TikTok. It's on Instagram. It's on YouTube that has gotten about 2 million views. With me saying the modern day Egyptians are the ancient Egyptians. The expert population geneticist, the expert who speaks on genetic populations just co-signed me and agreed, because that's exactly who they are. The ancient Egyptians never disappeared. This is not Chief X's wild idea. This is what the experts are telling you. Now, this same man has this blog I want to show you. Let me share my screen again. He wrote about this. Let me blow it up so you can see. And this is the title. It says Ancient Egyptians, Black or White. This population genetics master wrote a whole article about it. And when you scroll down, I don't want to go through this whole article, but you can check it out when you can. It's Ancient Egypt. It's titled Ancient Egyptians, Black or White, by Razib Khan. Do your own research and find it. All right? I'll try to put it in the chat. Hold on. Matter of fact, I'll put it in the chat right now. Okay, I put it in the chat. So let me get back to the article. So when I scrolled down and I was just reading some of it, let me just blow this up so we can all see and read together. Okay, where am I at? Okay, let's read right here. It says what you can't, I don't want to read the whole article, but it's basically saying the same thing. So what this article is about, just so you know before I read this, it's about the study of the mummies, the Abasir study. A guy wrote a whole article about it and broke it down in a different kind of way so people can read about it and understand. So what he says is, what you can see here is that to a great extent, ancient Egyptians were descended from a population closely related to Natufians, or Natufians themselves. This is easily explained in the mtDNA affinity to Neolithic farmers. Natufians and Anatolian Neolithic populations were sister populations. The F3 statistic, which looks at shared drift, shows an affinity to ancient Egyptians with ancient farmer populations with Near Eastern provenance, but also with modern Sardinians. This is a common pattern, as ancient groups do not have later migration waves with the Sardinians, the modern population closer to this. Now, this is the last paragraph. And you see in the bar plot, because he has different graphs up here, you guys can check it out later. I'll put it in the chat. You can see in the bar plot that northern Levantine populations are placed between Anatolian, Neolithics, and Natufians, as one might expect based on their geographical positions and gene flow between these two regions. Additionally, the cyan color is associated with eastern farmers from the Zagros. I have already talked about the gene flow from this area to the Levant recently. If you compare Bronze Age Scythian samples, I think you'll see broad affinities with these late period Egyptians, right? And here we go, the end of it. The PCA gives us results consonant with the model-based clustering. If you plot the genetic variation of ancient Egyptians, they are closest to Neolithic Eastern Mediterranean populations. No surprise. So when I say they're Mediterranean people, this geneticist, this expert agrees with me. I said the modern day Egyptians are the ancient Egyptians. I also say they're Mediterranean people. He agrees with me. Neolithic Eastern Mediterranean populations is no surprise. I'm sorry, it has nothing to do with sub-Saharan Africans. Okay? So, if you want to check that article out, I put it in the chat. And it's an article written by him. Okay, so what I really wanted to do today, let me come back to y'all. What I really wanted to do is just play a podcast audio of two experts having a conversation literally about the study, the DNA study of the Abusir mummies. I've never heard two experts just sit down and talk about that, besides people on YouTube in the conscious community running their mouth and they know nothing about it, really. So it's about a 30-minute discussion that these two guys are having, basically an interview. And he's going to break down the Abusir study, DNA test of the mummies, in a conversation that has basically been saying everything that I've been saying and trying to teach. Now, if you're not into this, it may get boring. These are two experts having a 30-minute conversation. But it's breaking down clearly who the ancient Egyptians are and who the modern day Egyptians are, who the Coptics are. And the case is really closed after listening to this. There's no expert that disagrees. This is the consensus. Black Egypt has been thoroughly debunked. Let's go. Let me make sure the audio's here. You can hear it good. But let's go.
And we think this is why we have the dawn of what we think of, again, as ancient Egypt proper, around the end of the 4th millennium. BC.
Yeah, I want to jump in here and just mention that, as Spencer alluded to, there was a period when the climate in, what we call the Sahara, the northern half of Africa, or the northern third of Africa, was considerably more humid. It was more semi-desert, perhaps even savanna. And so, the ecological context of how ancient Egypt comes into being is actually quite different than what we perceive it today, or even in the historical record, just because climates do change and local ecologies do change. And so you can imagine these hunter-gatherers with a rich landscape with hippopotami and giraffes and ostriches and all these other animals that are mentioned. And then, climate is changing and everyone's retreating to the river, which is the last kind of oasis of fertility. And this is a situation where you have an agricultural society that develops. And before we get into the genetics and the DNA, because this is what the podcast is about, and we're going to talk about a paper that really sheds some important light on some issues of demography and history and ancestry. But just a quick overview of the chronology here. So, as most of you probably know, Egypt is periodized into different time frames based on dynasties and separated by periods of chaos. And it's a very, very well understood historiography because the history of Egypt is so ancient. And one of the things that I do want to reiterate with Spencer is it's influenced so many people. And one of the reasons it's influenced so many people is just because it's so old. It influenced the Greeks. So the distance between, I don't know, like the old kingdom of Egypt and classical Athens in terms of time is more or about the distance between us and the ancient Romans. So for the ancient Greeks and Romans,
Let's just pause there and take that on board. Let's not rush past. I mean, we're talking about a history that has unfolded over millennia. You know, we're not talking about things happening over decades. We live in such a world of immediacy and the 24-hour news cycle. And, you know, if you do something today, it's forgotten in the next couple of days. And, you know, you're lucky if you're remembered beyond your death, you know, for a couple of decades or a century. But, you know, again, these are things that played out over millennia. This was an incredible civilization that lasted for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I think the continuity is difficult for us to grasp. So basically, you know, in many ways, the religion and the language and the institutional structures of ancient Egypt persisted for at least several thousand years. So from the Old Kingdom in 2500 BC, and then you have the Middle Kingdom around 2000, and then the New Kingdom, which is, you know, more famous, more well-known, partly just because we have more artifacts, so that's more recent. That's 5,000.
So that's King Tut, that's Ramses II, that's, you know, the arrival of the Sea Peoples who had an impact on Levant. All these big events in prehistory happened during the New Kingdom.
And that was 1500 BC, right? 1500 to 1000 BC. The reason we have Champollion and we have these, ability to look into Egypt's past is Egypt lasted until the forerunners of our own Western civilization, the ancient Greeks. It lasted long enough for the ancient Greeks to interface with them. And so, you know, there are these Rosetta Stones of Greek writing, you know, various Demotic forms of writing, and then the hieroglyphs, and they can translate between each other because you had people who were fluent in all of these cultures because that's how long ancient Egypt lasted. And I do have to say, a little historical trivia. The last traditional Egyptian temple, which basically practiced the religion of the Egyptians as we understand it, and which goes back at least to 3000 BC, actually lasted down to the 6th century AD in Philae in southern Egypt. And that was shut down during the reign of Emperor Justinian about the year 525 AD. And so that's almost, that is over 3,000 years, 3,500 years of this continuous religious tradition, cultural tradition. So it's really hard for us to imagine and comprehend this. And I think that's why Egypt is so fascinating to us, because its continuity combined with the fact that we can actually perceive it in a really concrete way. So, Spencer mentions the name of an actual human.
Yeah, you got a block? Huh? You got a block? Let's see. What happened to the sound? Hold on, y'all. One second, y'all. Never mind, I found one. Oh. Okay. Wait a minute. The sound stopped. Hold on, let me get this going back.
Separated by periods of chaos.
A couple of days and an impact on Levant.
Greek writing east to 3000 BC.
Okay, we're back. Hold on, y'all.
actually lasted down to the 6th century AD in Philae in southern Egypt. And that was shut down during the reign of Emperor Justinian about the year 525 AD. And so that's almost, that is over 3,000 years, 3,500 years of this continuous religious tradition, cultural tradition. So it's really hard for us to imagine and comprehend this. And I think that's why Egypt is so fascinating to us, because its continuity combined with the fact that we can actually perceive it in a really concrete way. So, Spencer mentions the name of an actual human, Narmer. We have a dramatis personae of these kings and these pharaohs and these emperors that lived thousands and thousands of years ago. Whereas, I feel like
Now he's going to get deep into it. This is just a 30-minute conversation, so you got to really pay attention.
Example, we know that there are things that happen in Mesopotamia. Aside from a few legends, like the names have not come down to us nearly as intact, in part because the Mesopotamians did not interact as much with the Greeks. And so there was not that cultural translation and that tunneling of information down to the present. The Egyptians are not just archaeological artifacts. They're actually people. We know the architect that designed the early pyramids, Imhotep, because he was worshipped as a god down to the Roman era, down to the time of Caesar Augustus. That just goes to show you the impact of ancient Egypt in our own ancient world, when it was the ancient civilization. And now today in the 20th century and the 21st century, it comes back to us almost in full, in part because, it's a desert. That preserves a lot of artifacts, and also during the Roman period, it preserves a lot of papyrus. So we actually know a fair amount of it just because the preservation was so, optimal.
Yeah, that, of course, is a really, really important part of Egypt's history. The idea that it exists as a kind of, long, narrow oasis in the midst of a vast desert, the Sahara Desert. And again, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. If you go back to the 6th millennium BC, the 5th millennium BC, people living much further away from the river. But the river, of course, is what gives Egypt its life. The Nile arises in the high mountains of Uganda, Western Kenya, and so on. And the Blue Nile joins with the White Nile and eventually becomes the Nile. And you get a huge efflux of water in the northern hemisphere summer, so roughly June through September. You get flooding in the Nile that replenishes the fields that are planted along the Nile. Even today, it's really extraordinary. You travel to Egypt today, you travel on a boat perhaps, or as you're flying into Cairo, and you look out and you can see this band of green, fertile fields out to a certain point, and beyond that it's sand dunes. It's really extraordinary. It's a unique ecosystem, human ecosystem in the world. I really have never seen anything else like it any other place.
Yeah, and that ecosystem, the conditions, it doesn't just apply to archaeology, or it doesn't just apply to artifacts. It also applies to people. And with the Egyptians, we are lucky in a way that they are, people that were really invested in embalming and burying people in a way that preserved a lot of elements of their anatomy. And that's been really useful for anthropologists, physical and biological anthropologists. And now more recently, there has been the investigation of DNA. And actually the field of ancient DNA to some extent goes back to the Egyptians with some of Svante Pääbo's earlier work. Now, I believe that turned out to be spurious, correct? Like that was contamination.
Yeah, so Svante Pääbo, who we've talked about a lot on these podcasts, who famously sequenced the Neanderthal genome and the Denisovan genome and really kind of created the modern field of ancient DNA. He, back in the early 1980s, was getting his PhD in immunology at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and was extremely interested, had always been very interested in ancient history, and decided to collaborate with a team at the Egyptian Museum there. And in 1985, published a paper in Nature. The title was Molecular Cloning of Ancient Egyptian Mummy DNA. Now, as you say, Razib, it turns out this was likely some sort of contaminant, modern DNA that made it into the sample, but it really kind of pointed the way toward the idea that you might be able to get intact DNA that could be useful for studying the history of ancient populations from samples that were thousands of years old. Now, interesting, funny little anecdote. When he published that paper, he was still a graduate student. He was still finishing up his PhD. And another big character in the field of human population genetics / ancient DNA wrote to him. Alan Wilson, who was at University of California at Berkeley, wrote to him asking if he would like to collaborate on ancient DNA work. And Svante apparently was like, well, I'd love to, but I'm only a graduate student. So Wilson offered him a postdoc in his lab, and that's kind of, the beginning of the rest of his career. So he moved on to Berkeley and became a postdoc there. It was an amazing place to be at the time. Of course, the mitochondrial Eve work was being done in Wilson's lab at Berkeley at that time. So it was really an exciting place to be working in ancient human genetics. And, his work on ancient Egyptian mummies really kind of launched the field, even if that particular discovery wasn't true.
Yeah. And so, now it's 2020, and, 21st century, we have real data, real information. And this is really important and interesting to people because unlike in other situations, we know so much about the Egyptians. So it's kind of a contrast with, say, the LBK people, not very well known, maybe outside of archaeological circles or in Germany. In some of these situations, we only have DNA to inform us about the provenance of these people. This is the opposite, where we have so much information and so much knowledge and so much debate and so much awareness about who the Egyptians were that the DNA is very interesting, partly because it just adds to the complement of information. And so what we have here is there was a paper that came out, actually came out 3 years ago now, or 2.5 years ago, and it made a big media splash, obviously. And it was in Nature Communications, so it's open access, and I'll post the link in the show notes. I'll post the link for the listeners. Ancient Egyptian mummy genomes suggest an increase of sub-Saharan ancestry in post-Roman periods. There are two primary sets of data in here. There's 90 mitochondrial genomes that they have, and they also have 3 individuals where they have the whole genome, the autosome. So, the whole autosomal chromosomes that we normally talk about, they have 3 individuals with that. And they cover from the New Kingdom period, so the end of classical ancient Egypt, down to the Roman period and the Ptolemaic period, which is basically, Hellenistic, Roman, so 2,000 years ago.
And let me just say that alone is an extraordinary achievement because, after Svante published that initial paper, a lot of people got excited about getting ancient DNA from mummies. And once we discovered that a lot of the so-called results were actually contaminants, and I myself tried to sample an Egyptian mummy in a museum. It was actually on film, the film we did about the Phoenicians that aired on PBS in the States in 2004. We tried to sample King Tabnet, who was actually a Phoenician king from about 500 BC, but he was embalmed using Egyptian methods in an Egyptian sarcophagus. We got permission from the museum to remove him from the glass case that he was sealed in and take a tooth and take some tissue samples. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get any DNA out. This was a collaboration done with Alan Cooper's group, the Australian Center for Ancient DNA. And for a long time, until very recently, essentially, basically until this paper came out, people said, well, the embalming method just destroyed the DNA. They, modify it chemically in some way such that we're never going to be able to study the genetics of ancient Egyptians. And so this paper, as you said, was kind of a big deal.
Yeah. And so they had these, they had all this mtDNA, and they had these 3 individuals. Now, one of the things that often comes up in questions is, well, what can you find out from one individual? Well, the whole genome of an individual is actually a representation of this pedigree that goes back into the past. So you're sampling many, many individuals with genome-wide data. And from the 3 individuals that they had genome-wide data, they had hundreds of thousands of markers, of SNPs, of polymorphisms, which is an incredible amount of data if we had been talking about it 20 years ago. So I don't think we need to undersell and underemphasize how much genome-wide data they got, but they also got all of these, they got almost 100 ancient Egyptian mitochondrial genomes. And
Pause. He said basically what they did seek is kind of huge, and people shouldn't undersell it. Meaning it's some real shit.
the two of them, they used it to kind of synthesize a general result, which, I'll say it wasn't incredibly shocking to me, but it confirmed, I think, what we suspected. And so what they found is the pre-Ptolemaic and the Ptolemaic, so basically the classical ancient Egypt, 3,500 years ago, whatnot, and then 2,000 years ago, they had considerably less sub-Saharan African ancestry than modern Egyptians. Modern Egyptians are about on the order of 10 to 20%, depending on how you estimate it, sub-Saharan African ancestry. These ancient Egyptian samples seem to be considerably lower, although there was some evidence there. The easiest way actually to see it, though, is in the mitochondrial genomes. There are haplogroup L in the modern Egyptian samples. And, these are haplogroups that are generally found for the, uniparental nerds out there. They're generally found in sub-Saharan Africa. About 20% of the samples from the modern Egyptians. And they're very, very rare in the pre-Ptolemaic and, the Ptolemaic period. So, they're there too, but they're much lower frequency, under 5%. And then they also have a comparison with Ethiopians, which was a kind of a sub-Saharan population, just to test an alternative model. The genome-wide data showed the same general pattern with the three individuals, where they had considerably less sub-Saharan African ancestry than modern Egyptians, and they synthesized it with other results looking at modern Egyptians, which suggests that most of the African admixture, sub-Saharan African admixture you see in northern Africa seems to have arrived within about the last 1,000 years. Basically, with other results looking at modern Egyptians, which suggests that most of the African admixture, sub-Saharan African admixture you see in northern Africa seems to have arrived within about, with other results looking at modern Egyptians, which suggests that most of the African admixture, sub-Saharan African admixture you see in northern Africa seems to have arrived within about the last 1,000 years, basically the Islamic period. And what this is telling us is it's telling us more than just genetics. It's telling us about the nature of trade and connectivity and how people move over history and how that's changed. So we know that ancient Egyptians had contacts with sub-Saharan Africans. There were Nubian mercenaries in Egypt. They're described as Nubians. They're depicted differently from other Egyptians. There were West Asian mercenaries.
And just to clarify for people who maybe have not studied ancient history as much, Nubia was the kingdom beyond Upper Egypt, beyond the Upper Kingdom of Egypt. It was a separate culture. And in Egypt, it was turned upside down relative to the map. So by upper, they meant toward the headwaters of the Nile. So it was actually in the south of Egypt. Lower Egypt was in the northern part of Egypt. So Nubia would have been south of Egypt. And so this was a different kingdom, much more closely allied culturally and probably in terms of physical anthropology and genetics with people living in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, that seems
to the map. So by upper, they meant toward the headwaters of the Nile. So it was actually in the south of Egypt. Lower Egypt was in the northern part of Egypt. So Nubia would have been south of Egypt. And so this was a different kingdom, much more closely allied culturally and probably in terms of physical anthropology and genetics with people living in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, that seems to be about right. And so what this is telling us is, though ancient Egypt did have contacts with sub-Saharan Africa, it was much more diminished or much more attenuated than what occurred during the Islamic period. And I think, part of it is we need to think about the cultural context of the cultural toolkits. Domesticated camels became really, really important during the Islamic period. They seem to be present during the late classical period, but they're obviously not incredibly common. And if you can imagine a Sahara that's getting progressively more dry and difficult to traverse, the presence of a camel might have been a game changer in terms of human movement, south to north and north to south. And so the genetic patterns that we see in the northern third of Africa today, to some extent, they are new. On the other hand, there is the reality that it looks to be that 80% of the ancestry of modern Egyptians is very similar to what was present during the time of ancient Egypt. And so during the time of ancient Egypt. And so if you dry and difficult to traverse, the presence of a camel might have been a game changer in terms of human movement, south to north and north to south.
Pause. Listen to what he says.
And so the genetic patterns that we see in the northern third of Africa today, to some extent, they are new. On the other hand, there is the reality that it looks to be that 80% of the ancestry of modern Egyptians is very similar to what was present during the time of ancient Egypt.
Pause. He just said 80% of the genetics of modern day Egyptians is very similar to the ancient Egyptians. Chief X didn't say that. This master teacher said that, who's an expert in population genetics. The case is closed on Black Egypt. Black Egypt is debunked, but let's just finish.
And so if you want me to, during the time of ancient Egypt, and so if you want during the time of ancient Egypt, and so during the time of ancient Egypt, dry and difficult to traverse, the presence of a camel might have been a game changer in terms of human movement,
Here we go.
south to north and north to south. And so the genetic patterns that we see in the northern third of Africa today, to some extent, they are new. On the other hand, there is the reality that it looks to be that 80% of the ancestry of modern Egyptians is very similar to what was present during the time of ancient Egypt. And so if you want me to evaluate from these data whether modern Egyptians are descended from ancient Egyptians, on the whole, I will say yes. There are some details in the statistics here.
He said, and as a whole, the modern Egyptians are related to the ancient Egyptians. And you know what modern day Egyptians look like. They don't look like you.
That I feel misled some of the popular interpretations. So one thing that I do want to say is when you compare ancient DNA to ancient DNA, there are various statistical reasons why all of the ancient samples kind of look similar or more similar than you would expect. And so that's kind of in the back of my head when I'm hearing things from the media and in social media about how, oh, ancient Egyptians were more like ancient Sardinians and ancient Neolithic people in West Asia than they're like modern Egyptians. Well, I mean, that's kind of an ancient versus modern distinction, and it has to do with continuous gene flow and stuff that's happened the last 2,000 years over all modern populations. The other issue is Sub-Saharan African ancestry is very, very distinct from the ancestry in Northern Africa, which much of it is probably West Eurasian backflow out of the Levant and areas like that.
What? Listen again.
With the Natufians and, with all modern populations. The other issue is Sub-Saharan African ancestry is very, very distinct from the ancestry in Northern Africa, which much of it is probably West Eurasian backflow out of the Levant and areas like that, with the Natufians and, with periods that are beyond and earlier than the purview of what we're talking about. And so when you add 20% ancestry, that's very, very different. When you look at a visual representation, it will give you the average and it will shift them out. That doesn't mean that their whole ancestry is very different. What it means is the mix of who they are is quite distinct from the ancient Egyptians, but the predominant element of their ancestry is actually descended from ancient Egypt. Modern Egyptians may speak Arabic, but that is a language that they adopted over the last 1,500 years from their original language, which is still preserved in the Coptic liturgy as Coptic, which is very different from the Semitic languages, although distantly related.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't think it's terribly surprising, I guess, although there have been a lot of population turnovers, and we talk about that a lot in these podcasts, but it's not terribly surprising that the people living in Egypt today are related to the people who lived in ancient Egypt. And that there has been a shift of sorts over the last couple of thousand years. Not too surprising. What I think is interesting is a broader debate, and one that was a big deal back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, about whether ancient Egypt was a so-called African culture, i.e. sub-Saharan African, or a Mediterranean culture. And what these data seem to suggest, I mean, very strongly, is that, it was part of a much broader kind of Mediterranean world. The ancient Egyptians strongly is that, it was part of a much broader kind of Mediterranean world. The ancient Egyptians were closer to people living in the Levant and the Middle East than they were to people living in places like Kenya and Tanzania.
What did I tell you? They Let's just hear this again.
Strongly is that, it was part of a much broader kind of Mediterranean world. The ancient Egyptians were closer to people living in the Levant and the Middle East than they were to people living in places like Kenya and Tanzania. So I think that's a really interesting finding from this.
Yeah, although, going back to an earlier podcast which we did about paleogenetics in Africa, the people in Kenya and Tanzania during the time of ancient Egypt itself were very different from the people in Kenya and Tanzania today, because the Bantu expansions had not spread that cultural toolkit as of yet. And so
absolutely
one of the interesting things is ancient Egypt is literally so ancient that it's difficult sometimes to relate it to the modern topography of genetic variation, because so much has changed in this intervening period. I do think that the continuity in Egypt itself is illustrative of the fact that in most cases, once you get a certain level of agricultural density, there has to be something really big to perturb it and to turn it over. And what we know from the extensive records that we have from, say, the Roman period is that Egypt was very dense, it was very highly populated, and its grain surplus, for example, actually fed the city of Rome, because the Nile River makes it very, very convenient to just load up grain and put it on a ship and send it across the Mediterranean. And so Egypt was this very wealthy, densely populated territory. And it's hard to imagine how conquest and conquerors would have replaced the native population to any substantial extent without us having a record of it, because there's just so many.
He said basically they couldn't be replaced. Let him say it again. Let me just rewind it again.
Records of Egypt, and there's to just load up grain and put it on a ship and send it across the Mediterranean.
Listen.
And so Egypt was this very wealthy, densely populated territory. And it's hard to imagine how conquest and conquerors would have replaced the native population to any substantial extent without us having a record of it, because there's just so many records of Egypt, and there's so much, recording of how dense it was, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question because, as you mentioned before, and to me, one of the most interesting things about Egypt is when these old, middle, new kingdoms break down because of contact or invasion from outside. The breakdown of the Middle Kingdom, what's known as the Second Intermediate Period, coinciding with the invasion of the Hyksos, these people from Western Eurasia who brought in the chariot and the compound bow and basically conquered Egypt around that time. So we're talking about 17th century, 16th century BC. Really interesting time in Egypt, and you have to wonder, did they bring in a lot of genetic impact as well, or was it simply a cultural phenomenon? I mean, there are a lot of questions that I think still need to be answered with a proper, time series or, transect through time, through these changes that we see in the archaeological record. Big, big questions that people have literally fought about, done PhD theses about, like, who were the Hyksos? What language did they speak? Were they really Indo-European, or did they simply have an Indo-European-like culture? Big questions like that I think archaeogenetics could really, help us to figure out the answers to.
Yeah, and, I do have to say the samples we have are from the New Kingdom. Who knows if the people in the Old Kingdom were actually considerably different? I'm kind of just assuming that there's continuity, partly because the cultural continuity between the New Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom is so strong that people just assume that they were the same people. And sometimes there are differences that will accumulate and people will assimilate to the native culture despite the long-term turnover. So, we don't know 100%. I do have to say the Y chromosomes that they got from the 3D samples were haplogroup J and E1B, 1B1. So those were not shocking or surprising in any way. That's kind of the haplogroups that you see in this area today, and so that hasn't changed. And the mitochondrial groups, I mean, again, they're typical Middle Eastern groups aside from the sub-Saharan ones. So in a way, like the finds here are not surprising. They're not novel. They're kind of confirming a, I guess, somewhat boring null hypothesis that the Egyptians were basically a North African, West Asian people, and during the Islamic period in particular, there's been mixing with
Egyptians was a what?
other types of people, mostly from the south, sub-Saharan Africa. There were some from the north, like the Mamelukes were often and the mitochondrial groups. I mean, again, they're typical Middle Eastern groups aside from the sub-Saharan ones. So in a way, like the finds here are not surprising. They're not novel. They're kind of confirming a, I guess, somewhat boring null hypothesis that the Egyptians were basically a North African, West Asian people.
The Egyptians were basically a North African, West Asian people. This is what the experts say. The gig is up. The Hotep hustle is over.
And during the Islamic period in particular, there's been mixing with other types of people, mostly from the south, sub-Saharan Africa. There were some from the north, like the Mamelukes were often Circassians from the Caucasus and whatnot. So obviously there's been some changes on the general flavor, but what I see in most Middle Eastern data is there's a base that comes down from, say, the Bronze Age. And this relates to a podcast I did with Mark Haber earlier, if you guys want to listen to the archives, where the people in the Levant, about 80% of their ancestry, something like that, 80, 90%, dates to actually the period of about the Middle Kingdom, or the New Kingdom in this paper. I'm a little earlier by a couple of centuries. And then there's other stuff on top of it due to the various migrations and movements that we read about extensively in the history. It didn't have a major genetic impact, and I think it's because for the vast majority of history, most people have been sedentary farmers here. These are not agropastoralists, really. They had some domesticated animals, but really they're focused on barley and wheat and these sorts of like the basic grains and primary production.
One of the interesting things about Egypt when we're thinking about these uniparental markers is when we first discovered a marker known as M70 on the Y chromosome, which at the time it was discovered, delineated a lineage we called K2. It's now haplogroup T, or a subset of haplogroup T, but a very widespread subset. We found that it was at high frequency in Egyptian populations, but it's at relatively low frequency in a lot of other populations. And so it seemed a little bit anomalous. That turns out to be the lineage, or one of the lineages, non-Sub-Saharan African lineages that we find at very high frequency in some of the groups in Chad that we sampled on that 2005 expedition. So it probably represents one of these old kind of Neolithic era lineages that connects that part of Africa, Egypt, Chad, probably Tunisia, other places in the Maghreb, with the Middle East, much older Middle Eastern patterns that date back to the Neolithic. Mm-hmm. So just, again, these uniparental markers, I think their era has come and gone in many ways, but I think they're actually still informative, particularly if you can interpret their patterns through the knowledge we have about whole genome data from ancient DNA.
Yeah, it is. This is, in the case of Egypt, we have a constellation of data, a constellation of information, and it's a situation where the sum is more than the elements of the parts, because you can synthesize it and bring it all together. So we have all this historical information, we have all this archaeology, and now we have Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA and some autosomal genomes. And
let me pause it, because I've been saying for the last few years that the modern day Egyptians retain about 68% of the genetic composition of the ancient Egyptians. This guy basically earlier, not now, saying 80% similar. It's deeper than I thought.
As I said, I'm not personally very shocked. Now, there has been, I mean, I'm just gonna like put this out there. There have been some like unsavory responses on the internet to these results, about like, you know, oh, the ancient Egyptians were actually our ancestors or not our ancestors. These sorts of like ethnically, you know, chauvinistic motivations. But I mean, the reality is the ancient Egyptians, they're their own people. They made a huge impact on world civilization. And it's kind of sad and unfortunate that they're getting co-opted by, you know, other actors for their own reasons. I think what these results show is like, oh, well, I mean, there's really straightforward evidence here that modern Egyptians are descended from ancient Egyptians, and ancient Egyptians are related to the other peoples of West Asia and North Africa. But I mean, people are digging through the civilization. And it's kind of sad and unfortunate that they're getting co-opted by, you know.
Now, listen closely.
Other actors for their own reasons. I think what these results show is like, oh, well, I mean, there's really straightforward evidence here that modern Egyptians are descended from ancient Egyptians, and ancient Egyptians are related to the other peoples of West Asia and North Africa. But I mean,
West Asian and North Africa.
People are digging through the supplements of these papers to support their own agendas. And I think we just need to always reemphasize, like, it's not about the agenda. It's about what the results are telling us about these people who we already know the general outline of them. They are not a mysterious population or mysterious culture.
I think that's a really good point. This is always the danger when you study human history using genetic methods, particularly in this era where a lot of people have tested themselves using personal genomics. They know their haplogroup, and they like to identify with that haplogroup as though they're members of a clan or even a gang in some cases. It can get a little scary. We have to remember that every population that we study, during the period that we're studying it, whether it's in the present day or it's, some peek into an archaeological site in the past, there's simply a slice in time of that population, and populations do shift over time. I mean, that's part of the reason why seeing this sort of continuity over thousands of years is fascinating and relatively unusual in many parts of the world, certainly in Europe.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's really worth bearing in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to ask you, if you could discover anything using the archaeogenetics or ancient DNA of ancient Egypt, what would it be? What are your big burning questions you have about these people and how they coalesced and changed or stayed the same over time?
This is the end of this discussion. Is coming to an end, but he just asked him a question. Like if he just had a question, he's asking the expert. If he just had a question about something he just wanted to know, and he's just gonna, give you what he worries and what he questions. So I'm just letting you know.
I can think of like two immediate things. One is I would actually be curious about Y chromosomal pedigrees of all of the mummies of all of these pharaohs and high status males that we have, and try to see if we can see changes over times of lineages, how they relate to modern Egyptians and how they relate to ancient Egyptians. Because, we have these records of how they had all these wives and these concubines, and they had all these children. Well, is that true? Are there a lot of, Genghis Khan type lineages in ancient Egypt? This guy supposedly owned the whole country as his property, right? The other thing that he
was a god.
Yes.
Yeah, he is pharaoh, and she, if it was a female pharaoh,
Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut. Yeah, they were literally gods on earth. And they not only owned the country, but the country was an extension of them in a sense. It's hard to separate. So yeah, I think that's a really big question. I also there was a lot of incest going on.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think just looking at the level of incest would be fascinating. It's almost Game of Thrones style.
Yes. Well, so we know this. We know this. Obviously, there's been, I think, some evidence from a couple of using really primitive methods of inbreeding and some of the ancient individuals. Obviously, we need more. And there's plenty of records in Roman times where even peasants were practicing, incest basically, because that was
RBG, you should be listening instead of trying to debate somebody. This is not your lane. You got to let it go, bro. You should be listening. That's how you learn, when you listen. If you're arguing in the chat, you're not listening. Okay? That race baiting, saying white supremacy talking points don't mean nothing over here. You're not gonna influence nobody and and try to tap our emotions and bring up white supremacy. Cut the bullshit. It don't work over here. We're adults over here. This is science talking. It has nothing to do with race talking. The man talking is from Bangladesh. That has nothing to do with white supremacy. He's not a white man. See how silly y'all be? It can be a Chinese writing an article, and then somebody will say, "Oh, it's a white man knowledge." Don't even know, didn't even look at the author's name to see it's an Asian man talking. Stop.
The custom in their country. This is obviously very deleterious to have, like, siblings marrying from a genetic perspective because the recessive alleles that get exposed. But, it was their cultural pattern, and that would be curious. I would be curious how widespread it was a long, long time ago. Because it could be a matter where it was mostly an elite practice, and then it percolated. One issue with ancient Egypt that's interesting is it actually wasn't a very patriarchal society in a context of the Near East. A lot of the royal, it seems like some of the pharaohs married into the royal lineage, and that your mother had to be of the royal lineage. And so this is actually one of the reasons that
So he was speaking on a little incest and how to be, royal lineage. And, when they talk this stuff, they're just an extreme, to me, that's an extreme, basically saying Egyptians stay to themselves. No matter who was coming in and out, they still will stand to themselves. They wasn't just fucking all kind of other people and having babies. No. Egyptians will stand to themselves.
Sometimes people married siblings because that amplified your royal power by having, like, both sides be royal. Because if the maternal side matters and you marry a woman who is not of the royal family, then obviously that diminishes your status. Anyway, there's a lot. We know so much about Egypt. There's just so many questions we could ask. And Egypt, in a way, ancient Egypt is the terminus of, like, a bigger prehistoric story, which I think gets a little overshadowed, partly because the luster and just the shine of Egypt is so strong. You mentioned Narmer. So one of Narmer's legendary predecessors, who we don't have as much evidence of, was named Scorpion. And that's the Scorpion King, which has been turned into a movie franchise in the 2000s, which, like, very, 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 very tenuous relationships to the history. But it's like Egypt touches so many aspects of our modern popular culture. It's a little mind-blowing. It's a little mind-blowing that this culture that existed, 4,000 years ago, like, at its peak, is now looming so large. Like, there's songs like Walk Like an Egyptian, that you're talking about. A lot of the motifs of ancient Egypt are very familiar to us today. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and someone was mentioning how their kids are really into ancient Egypt because they went to the museum and, they saw some Egyptian stuff, and now they're just, like, reading all about ancient Egypt, and how that doesn't happen with Greco-Roman stuff. And I don't know why, but I actually perceive that too.
Yeah, listen, if you have been to Egypt, particularly if you've been to Giza, if you've been to Thebes, in my opinion, that's really the most stunning place just to walk around and take it in. The size of the monumental sculpture there is incredible. And obviously the Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens, it really is overwhelming. My God, this stuff has been around for so long, and it looks so beautifully preserved because of the climate. It's really that combination of this incredibly advanced, craft making culture and the skill of the craftspeople to build.
See, people like a lot of the Afrocentrics would try to confuse you about the study, and they'll only try to say is the Roman period, Ptolemies, whatever. It starts off with the New Kingdom. They'd like to leave that one out. It's part of the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom involves King Tut, right? I think Queen T is in the New Kingdom. I think. You know what I mean? Their grandparents are Yuya, Thuya, right? Let's go. It's almost over. I think 2 more minutes.
These things, the carvings and the monuments and so on, and the fact that it's stuck around largely unchanged. I mean, these things, if they were in Northern Europe, would have been eaten away by, winters and ice and snow and rain and wind and all this other stuff. But in Egypt, they've been preserved and they look like they could have been made in the last, few years. It's really overwhelming.
Yeah, and I mean, I haven't been, but I mean, just everyone always says the monumental aspect of so much of this is also a big deal. I mean, there are parts of the world, including much of Northern Europe, frankly, where, if you're an archaeologist, your bread and butter is to dig up and assemble pot shards, because that's what's still around from a long time ago, with the exceptions of a few things like megaliths, But in ancient Egypt, you have so much, monumental architecture and remains from such an antique period. When you have the buildings of these people, of this civilization above ground and still kind of in your face, I think that brings it home in a way that it wouldn't otherwise.
It really does. The megaliths, Stonehenge, I've been there, and they're big stones. It's impressive, but they look like big old stones. They don't look like, well-crafted monumental pieces of the museum this year. So we've been really putting together about your grandparents.
To bring it all together, to recreate.
Okay. So this is the first time we hear 2 experts having a discussion about the DNA study of the mummies. The 2 experts 100% agree with what I've been saying over the last 2 years. He basically said 80% of the genetic makeup of today's modern day Egyptians, the one you see in Egypt, the modern day Egyptians. I'm not talking about no people hanging on the border. I'm not talking about no Nubian Egyptians. I'm not talking about nobody in the Nubian village. I'm talking about modern day Egyptians, Caucasoids, or the ancient Egyptians. They said it. They also clarified that, in general, ancient Egypt is made up of West Asian, North African stock, not sub-Saharan. They also alluded to the further you go back in the pre-Ptolemies, meaning pre-Ptolemy is actually the first dynasty. The further you go back, the less sub-Saharan African there is. That's what the expert said, not Chief X. So we're finalizing this debunking of Black Egypt. And I just had to, after I listened to the teacher Razib Khan, I checked him out, and just to hold on. People should go to here. He has his own page called Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning, where he's talking about different subjects. Right here, this subject he's talking about is human pigmentation, the genetics of evolution in human shades, for y'all who like to talk about the skin color variation thing. Okay? We were talking about population genetics just now. And right here, if you want to watch this whole video, which I played about 30-second clip of, he seems to think that when we say is racial social construct, it is in a sense, he says, but he breaks it down, but I don't have time. This is a whole hour and 41-minute video right here. Genes, Race, and History with Razib on the Coleman Hughes YouTube channel. So just to go to the guy's channel, Razib, Unsupervised Learning. This is Razib, the guy who was talking in the podcast. This is Razib. If you want to check out some of his discussions and works, Razib talks to no one but professionals and experts, right? Razib deals with professionals and experts, as you can see. Wait a minute, he has Steven Pinker on here? Oh, I know he legit then. If he has Steven Pinker on here.
When I read The Blank Slate, so I'll just say,
Steven Pinker
with the next part. When I read The Blank
is a
Slate,
brilliant
I knew
scholar.
some of what you had written about, but I got exposed to a lot more of the literature. And so, for example, Judith Rich Harris, who I just mentioned.
Okay, so where were we? Let me just go here. Just letting you know that Razib has degrees in biology, has another degree in biochemistry, and was in grad school. Here you go, biochemistry. And has a Bachelor of Science in biochemistry. And he has a Bachelor of Science in biology. And he is into population genetics. He's even worked for the Times newspaper, right? And he's Bangladesh American. So it's nothing biased. He's not white, he's not black, he's not Arab, he's not North African. He's not Egyptian, he's none of that. So he just gave his unbiased opinion. Not opinion, excuse me. He spoke on the facts in an unbiased way. And I just wanted to drop with you guys. Hold on one second, y'all. Let me hide this. You know, I meant to call Ngozi or Gullah Geechee, and I wanted to invite them on after I finished. But I didn't see them. What you say, Acadia? Let me read what you said. You said, I follow him on Twitter. He dropped the latest Northwest African Genome publication from June. Back in June via nature.com. He said, Chief X, it basically says what you've been saying. Yeah. People just gonna have to bend the knee, Acadia. I've been giving them that real ever since. But Ngozi and Gullah didn't show up. Hold on, y'all. And we're going to end it, my son, saying peace out.
Peace.
All right, y'all, I'm out.